Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we are sharing some tips on deciding where to take the bar exam. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy this show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today, we're talking about making the decision to take California or some other state-specific exam, or the UBE. Well, Lee, I know that you mentioned you've had a lot of conversations with prospective bar takers about this recently, so why don't you give us some thoughts?
Yeah, this keeps coming up a lot. And I think, especially right now with the current remote exam, people are starting to think more globally about where to sit for the bar than maybe they used to. And I think it also has to do with people really thinking about whether or not they need their individual state where they're sleeping, that bar exam, based on the work that they're going to do. So for instance, oftentimes if you work in-house, it does not matter where you are licensed. If you work for the federal government, it does not matter where you are licensed. Some people don't even want to practice law, so it really doesn't matter when you're where you're licensed, but they just want to be able to say that they're an attorney and not just have the signature where it's like comma JD.
Yeah, that's always a giveaway.
I know, which is like, that just means comma, not a lawyer.
Comma, didn't pass the bar exam yet.
Right, exactly. And, I think there are also a group of people who've been struggling with one bar exam or one state's passing threshold, and they want to mix it up. And I think this happens a lot for people who have continued to struggle with the California bar exam and then want to take an easier exam after that.
Right. And I think as the UBE becomes, more uniform across the country and starts to really spread, more and more people really are questioning, do I need to take this very state-specific test? Is it absolutely necessary that I do this? Because the reality is, once you've taken the UBE, you have that portable score. So it just gives you so much more flexibility, particularly if it's early in your career, you may be not sure exactly where you want to settle long term. When you're looking at a state like, say, Virginia or something, it's just like, really? Unless you're definitely staying there for your whole career, I'm not sure that I would say go take that exam.
Yeah, I think that that's very true. So for some people who might be listening to this who don't really understand the basics of how this UBE score works, let's just give the Cliff Notes version, because I think a lot of people don't know. So if you are considering to, let's say, shop around, you should know that although the UBE is a standardized test throughout all the jurisdictions that have adopted it, each state gets to grade their own test, and each state gets to select their own passing score. So not all states are the same. So to the point where I think it's Arizona is always one of the tricky ones. I think it's a 280, whereas in other jurisdictions, I think Michigan or Alabama, 260. Very different. Very different. So, even if you're thinking about score portability, one of your goals is also to get the highest score possible so it can be the most mobile score around the jurisdictions. Because one of the things that a lot of people in Arizona talk about is should they just kind of travel on over to New Mexico, which has a lower score that you need to be licensed. But then they still won't get that very high score needed necessarily on the test. And then they can't just drive back over to Arizona and try and get a license because Arizona's like, you didn't get the super high score. You got to take it again. So you really need to think about these things that you're trying to do. Just because you're licensed in one state doesn't automatically mean that you're going to get reciprocity in another UBE state. Oftentimes it has a lot to do with the individual scores.
Right. Or, if you practice long enough, they might let you. But, the goal of the UBE, like you said, is get a high enough score. You can just basically use it anywhere. It doesn't really matter where you sit. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
And certain states just let you sit there even if you know that you're not planning to apply to be admitted. So that's interesting. I think we've got some blog posts around that. But, basically the idea is the score you get once, and then you can use it in various jurisdictions as needed. As opposed to, congratulations, you're licensed in California. Hope you never want to move.
Right. Yeah, it's like, good luck.
Because I don't really think they have reciprocity basically with anyone. So, and some states have always had more reciprocity than others. I mean, there are these notorious outliers like California and Florida that basically don't want a bunch of people retiring there. So therefore, other states, not unreasonably, are like, well, sorry, we're not going to let your people come here either. Goodbye.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I also think you want to try and think further down in your career too, because depending on the type of law that you want to practice, sometimes that'll drag you to certain locations around the country. I have a friend who does aviation law, and there are really only a few states that you really practice aviation law.
Right.
I think Texas is one of them. And so, he kind of had to go to Texas to practice this very specific kind of law. That's kind of in his career. If he really wanted to be at the top of his field, that's where he kind of needed to go. So as much as you can look down the road, it is helpful to kind of plan ahead. I think that there is this idea around the UBE now that it's like, well, I'll just go take Iowa because they have a high pass rate. And it's like, okay, well, make sure that you really can get that law license in Iowa. You still have to meet all the requirements for licensure if you want an Iowa bar card. So you're going to need to do, if they have some sort of moral character or ethics exam, you still need to talk to these different jurisdictions and learn about them. It's just not so easy as paying your money and just, logging in on the remote site to take the test. So there are a lot of other steps to getting a law license somewhere else. And I think oftentimes people don't really understand that.
Well, also, I think, looking at UBE, I'm not sure it makes that much sense to talk about the pass rate in this state is higher or not. I think what makes more sense is to look at what their score requirement is, because the pass rate presumably has more to do with the pool of people who are sitting for that particular exam. It's not like you're magically going to get a higher score if you take the test in a different state. You're going to get whatever score you get. And
some of these states have a pretty small pool of people who sit.
Exactly. And it's probably people who went to, the local law school, they have a certain set of characteristics, and you can pretty well predict from year to year, how they're going to do. Other places are not really like that. You have New York or California, have tons of people sitting who have completely different qualifications. And, the overall pass rate has not a lot to say about what your actual odds of passing may be.
Right. So, when people start asking these questions about which test to take, the common questions are, but what is the easiest?
Right. Which one's
That's
easiest?
My favorite question. What's the easiest? And so I always have to give my lawyer answer of, it depends.
Right.
Right.
Well, I think this used to be more of an issue. When I first sat before everyone was using the UBE, I was trying to decide, should I take California? Should I take New York? I wasn't sure where I wanted to work. And I was clerking in Boston, and my judge says, oh, why don't you take Massachusetts? And I was like, well, I don't really think I want to stay in Boston. It's too cold. He says, yeah, but they have a 90% pass rate. And I think I signed up that day.
Right.
Because, that was significantly higher. And I just sort of looked at it and was like, well, I just need to be licensed someplace. And in the end, it turned out it really barely mattered where I was licensed, because all I did was I was a patent litigator, which I didn't know I was going to do at the time I took the bar. But that's all federal, so it didn't matter, If we were going to a case in Delaware, we just hired local counsel and everyone waved in, and it didn't make any difference that I was admitted in Massachusetts and other people were admitted in California. It was totally irrelevant.
Yeah, that's true. So, I also think when you're making this decision, you kind of have to think ahead, make a choice that makes sense for you. Because I think, if you really want to practice in California and then you just are like, well, I'll go to some other state and take the UBE, but I want to practice California law. So then I'll have to get some job where it doesn't matter for the 5 years. And then maybe I can take the attorney's exam. And that's awfully complicated.
Right.
So you just really need to follow through these scenarios to make sure that you fully appreciate what you're signing up for. With all that time and effort, should you just hire a tutor or figure out what's going on the California bar and see if you can win that war? Maybe. If that's really the goal that you're trying to meet.
Yeah, I think if somebody knows that they're fairly certain they want to be in a particular place, then you should just take that exam. I mean, duh,
Yeah,
like,
I know.
sometimes you get these really convoluted scenarios where you're just sort of like, but what you're telling me is, your entire life and all of your family and everyone you want to be near are in California.
Mm-hmm.
But rather than just studying for the California bar, you're going to first go try to take the UBE, and then you're going to turn around a year from now while you're working and try to take California. I'm like, this doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Like, just keep it simple.
So one of the other reasons why people love to talk about this kind of forum shopping, as I've come to call it, is they are struggling to pass their jurisdiction. They're struggling to get to that 280 in Arizona. They're struggling to get to the 1390 in California. And they really want to figure out like where they're more likely to pass. And so I think this is also a complicated analysis depending on your individual situation. Because we've said like easier can mean a lot of different things. And the problem is that the tests themselves aren't that different anymore.
Right.
I think it used to be back in the day that New York had a lot more multiple choice. And so the rule of thumb was that foreign trained attorneys often did better in New York because it was easier for foreign trained attorneys to do multiple choice than to do the writing heavy 3-day California exam. That was one of the kind of like rules of thumb. And but now the exams in California and New York are both 2 days, and they both have 1 day of writing and 1 day of multiple choice. And a lot of these differences have somewhat washed away. And so you really want to see like what's the same. So the UBE and the California bar are both 2 days now. They have 1 full day of multiple choice. They both have 90-minute performance tests, although California only has 1. And then they have essays. And the difference is California has 5 60-minute essays, and the UBE has 6 30-minute essays. But you're still doing a day of writing on each one. So they're different, but they're not necessarily as different that I think people wish they would be.
Right. And also California has lowered their passing score to 1390. So that at least at the margin is going to put them closer to some of these UBE states, certainly. So I think the differences are kind of collapsing a bit. But yeah, I mean, if somebody's super far off from passing in California and they've taken the exam, a couple of times and they're still really far off, I'm just not sure you're magically going to get better at the bar exam because you switch jurisdictions.
Right, because you have to go learn new law.
Right.
And that's the thing.
Yeah.
UBE teaches stuff that's not tested on the California bar.
Yeah, secure transactions. Woo.
Well, I know, which is like the most heavily tested topic.
And no one likes that.
No one likes
I think
it.
Actually they test CIPRO. They test CIPRO most.
It's civil procedure and secure transactions. They're like some of the top 2.
I mean, and those are not most people's favorite topics, let's face it.
No. So it is important to really think through this. I was just talking to someone who's been struggling with California, who was wrestling with this decision. The MBE was the pain point.
Oh, well, that's not going to make any difference.
Right. The MBE is going to be another test.
Yeah.
So you could either restudy for California, where you're already passing the writing portion, to try and get that MBE score up, or spend extra time studying brand new law and new strategies for a different test, and still dealing with the MBE problems. If you want to practice law in California, I think you take the California exam in that scenario.
Oh, for sure. Because why would you? I mean, you're just making the part you're already passing harder for yourself and still not passing the part you're not passing. Like, I don't know. That doesn't, I think you're better off just getting an MBE tutor at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you've got to figure out like what are the underlying issues that you're struggling with. And I think that so often this decision of like, well, let's just throw this other exam away and go try something else. Sure, you hear stories of that working, but the reality is exam taking problems tend to follow you around. Like they don't disappear just because you move to a different state. So if you struggle with multiple choice, you're still going to struggle with multiple choice in that new state. You struggle with writing, you're still going to struggle with writing. You've got to figure out, what are the underlying issues. Now, one time I will say that forum shopping is important, is about accommodations. And this is something that I have definitely seen come up with students. Some states, UBE states, are notoriously difficult in dealing with accommodations. New York, I'm talking about you. I've heard some horror stories. Their appeals process is not particularly clean, feels like it doesn't meet ADA requirements, but I'm not an ADA lawyer, so I don't know. But
it's not legal advice, just information.
I'm just saying it has made me like crinkle my nose and be like, that doesn't pass the sniff
I'm
test.
not sure that that's really okay, but what is your recourse? Yeah, answer to that question. Your recourse is basically probably considering applying somewhere next door.
Yeah, like, hey, New Jersey.
Yeah, you're so much nicer. You'll consider my application for accommodations. And once you have the score, it doesn't matter.
Right, right, exactly. And so accommodations is one thing that you really want to think about. The other thing that I have had come up with, not just who's nicer or more generous with their accommodations or maybe has actual due process around the accommodations process, is what they will give accommodations for and the timeline of the application. You know, we have had students who've had surgeries or get pregnant or are breastfeeding or things like can change kind of late in the game. And some states, you know, have time to apply for accommodations when other states you don't. So you really have to like pick up the phone and find out this information. And I think that would be the other piece of advice is if you're really planning to forum shop, you need to do some research. You need to call these jurisdictions. The rules are constantly changing. So you need to do a deep dive and make sure you understand the pros and cons of each jurisdiction and make sure that if you take that test there, that you can get the law license.
Right. I know one place people like to take sometimes is DC because they'll let you pass only portions of the exams. You know, maybe you pass the MBE, maybe you pass the writing, and the next time you can only sit for part of it. You know, things like this, like sometimes are appealing to people for various reasons. I'm not sure if any other states do that, but
I don't think so. I think that's a DC thing.
Yeah, so that's a weird one.
That's a weird one. Yeah, you know, and I think that's because so many people waive. I don't even know why they would do that. So many people waive into DC.
Yeah, I think they let you waive in with like, or at least they let you use your like MBE score. I don't know. It's complicated. Again, like go and look it up. But there are, you know, say that you did passing on the MBE in a different jurisdiction, but you didn't. I guess people do it because they passed the MBE in a different jurisdiction. They didn't pass the essay, so their total score wasn't passing. So then DC will let them only sit for the essay, so then they could focus basically on that.
Yeah.
So there's some weird stuff out there. Everyone's making up their own rules.
Yeah, everybody's making up their own rules. And I think that that's one of the things that's kind of weird about this whole UBE movement is it's standardized, but not.
Right.
which makes it a little strange.
Yeah.
You know, like really Arizona has to be that different from New Mexico. It just seems strange. But it is.
Well, I find it fascinating. Like if you look at the distribution of scores required across the country, it's not necessarily like what I might expect just on kind of general knowledge of different states.
No.
So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I do think if you really aren't sure where you want to end up and you don't have a really firm plan, I would lean strongly towards taking this test in a UBE jurisdiction just because you have more flexibility. Yes, you know, more and more states are coming online with the UBE. So again, like they all have different rules about how old your score can be and things like that. But I mean, one of those interesting questions is what do you do if you are interested in being licensed in a state that has announced that they're going to switch to the UBE, but they haven't yet? I think that's a tricky one. I mean, you definitely want to be sure. I mean, the ideal scenario would be that they say up front, you know, we'll accept scores within 5 years or something. And then you just go sit in a UBE state, get that score and, you know, eventually get licensed a year or two later. But, you know, it seems it would be very annoying to me as an applicant if the state's about to switch, but they haven't. And then I end up with this like one-off score that a year later I could have used halfway across the country.
Well, and that was one of the big things during COVID, which was, you know, you could take this exam, but is it a transferable score?
Right.
Or is it not a transferable score? Should you delay? You know, I mean, that was such a frustrating time for so many people because a lot of people were like, but I'm taking the UBE, so it'll be a transferable score.
Yeah, the July 2020, the switch to October 2020-ish. Yeah, that was a real mess because the whole point is the portability. And if you don't have that, then it's, you know, a different scenario.
Yeah. I think it's going to be interesting in the aftermath of all these remote exams, you know, what will happen with some of this. If some states decide to continue to give remote exams, which I realize depends a lot on the National Conference of Bar Examiners' willingness to provide the remote exam, I think you're going to see people doing a lot more of this kind of shopping around, which may in the end lead to more standardization if they think that that's really what people are doing.
Yeah. I mean, it's just such a, it's kind of a wild world out there. You just have to really be sure you understand, what you're getting into and what you're signing up for, and make sure that whatever your outcome you're looking for is achievable based on where you're taking the test. Because things are in flux. They're even talking about changing the exams in a few years. And, the questions are like, well, when's California going to switch to the UBE? And most people seem to think it's inevitable at some point, but they haven't announced anything. So we are in kind of this state of flux.
Yeah. I still think it all goes back to really sitting down and thinking about where you want to be and what type of work you're planning on doing and what license is going to be the most meaningful. I really do. I think,
and not overcomplicating it. People sometimes can sort of game things out where you're like, but this just doesn't really make a lot of sense. It seems like you're making it way more complicated than you need to. You have no reason not to just sit in New York. Just sit in New York.
Right. I think that's true. And hopefully post-COVID, and we don't have to have all these different, decisions about taking it in person, taking it remotely, all of these crazy decisions. It'll just be what makes the most sense for your profession as a whole. And you just, like everything in life, you just make the decision with the information you have in the moment and go from there. And nobody knows exactly what's going to happen in the future. And I wouldn't put money on what states like California will do, because I've always been surprised. I was shocked that they reduced the score to 1390, to be honest.
Right. Or shocked that they went from 3 days to 2 days. We're like, whoa, didn't see that coming. Yeah. I mean, if I'd graduated now, then my decision would have been a lot easier about what to take, because I would have said, well, I'm clerking in Boston. There's a high likelihood I might work in New York. I'll sit in one of those states and take the UBE. But that wasn't a choice at the time.
Yeah. So you just make the best decision you can. And just remember that, these tests are really, you can conquer them. It is an achievable goal. Sometimes it takes work and creativity, but just make sure that you set yourself up for success no matter what plan you make. I think that's the key. Don't say, oh, I'm going to go take this UBE jurisdiction with a 260 cutoff so I don't have to study. That's a terrible idea.
Right. I mean, people have to be realistic about what they're getting into. None of these exams are simple. None of them are easy. None of them can you just roll into without having looked at the material and pass. I don't think anyone could really do that.
No. And you also have to think, so you're sitting in a job interview and you're in some other state and they're like, you have a license in Alabama, but you went to law school in Chicago. You're like, yeah. So what was in Alabama? The lower bar score? I mean, you just got to think how the story is going to play out. And maybe some people will totally respect that, but, I don't know. I would probably ask that if we got a resume that had a random bar jurisdiction, and some people have very legitimate reasons. We often see it when they might be a partner of somebody who's in the military. That seems very common. We've had people who worked for us who are in that situation who end up moving every couple of years. And so they're barred in whatever state was the first place they went, after law school. But, you got to think about how this stuff is going to look and play into your story.
Absolutely. I mean, it looks a little funny if you're just like, oh, I just went and got this because it was the only place that would let me in because I had a, 262.
Right, exactly. Which, I guess I respect for you getting that license, but you're going to still need to spin that story. I'm sure that, I think a lot of people don't care, the date of admission, but I think if the location seems a little odd, I'm sure that somebody's going to ask you about it.
Really going to ask. I mean, you're going to need to have some reason. You're going to need to be able to say, something about it.
Yeah, I would ask. I'd ask. It's on the list of things I would probably look at on a resume.
Yeah, we would probably be like, that's curious. Why do you think that they did that? And like, probably because that's the only place they could get admitted, don't you think? Yeah. We should ask about that.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, any final thoughts?
No, I mean, I think for me, it just goes back to, it's kind of a weird situation because on the one hand, don't overcomplicate things, but also consider the future. So, if you're not really that tied to a place, then I think giving yourself flexibility with the UBE is great. But if you are tied to a place, even if it's only for, say, a few years, I think just take it there and get it done.
Yeah. I mean, plenty of people go get licensed somewhere else. It's not fun, but you can do that.
Yeah, I mean, if you have to take another test, you take another test a few years later. I mean, it's not the end of the world.
No.
Done it. It wasn't fun, but whatever. Now I have 2 licenses.
And it's fine. You can meet that goal too.
I'm like, I guess if I get disbarred in one state, I guess I can always practice in the other.
Yeah, probably while you're practicing to get disbarred.
I was like, hey, I got the security blanket. If California kicks me out, I'll just go be reactivated in Massachusetts. I'm joking. I don't think they'd let me do that.
I don't know that they'd let you do that. I feel like if you get disbarred in one state,
it might carry over. They might at least ask some questions.
Like if you get your driver's license revoked from one state, I don't know that you can go get a new driver's license somewhere else.
Yeah, true. They're probably going to check.
I feel like there's some sort of like reporting requirement to that.
But hey, I mean, I don't know. I don't know that these states talk to each other. So there you go.
I know. I feel like there's a checkbox on the application. Have you been disbarred?
Actually, that's true. There is. Yeah, they'd probably ask me that before like letting me reactivate.
Probably, yeah. All right. Well, with that, we are out of time. I want to take a second to remind you to check out our blog at barexamtoolbox.com, which is full of helpful tips to help you prepare and stay sane as you study for the bar exam. We've got stuff about California, UBE, pretty much most bar exams, less about Florida and Louisiana. Sorry, guys. You can also find information on our website about our courses, tools, and one-on-one tutoring programs to support you as you study for the UBE or California bar exam. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you are still in law school, you might also like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or Alison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.